Hey, I'm Chloe and this is Abby. We're CF interns and we're going to be talking about why bad things happen
and how it works with God's plan for us. So to begin, we're going to open up in John chapter 13, verse 7, which says, Jesus answered him, "What I am doing you don't understand now, but afterwards you will know."
So to put in some context, Jesus is basically washing Peter's feet. And Peter doesn't understand what's going on. So he's like, "Why are you doing this?" And because it's a servant position and stuff.
Not something that Jesus would normally be doing as their master.
So when we're in bad times, when we're at bad times and troubling times, and we don't know why it's happening to us, and we're good people. But
it's important to remember that verse. You don't understand what I am doing now, but later, afterwards, you will understand.
It makes me think of a biblical character, Joseph. A lot of bad things happened to him. He had 11 brothers, and he was the favorite of his father. And his brothers hated him for it. And they hated him even more when he told them about these dreams that he had been having, which had God's promise to him about ruling over his brothers and his parents. And so that made his brothers very angry, and they sold him as a slave.
Yeah.
But despite that bad situation, God used it for good, and it ended up helping Joseph serve have a higher position as a slave for Potiphar, and who was one of the Pharaoh's captain of the guards. And then Joseph was wrongly accused of something and thrown in prison. And he had stayed there for a while. And then God used that for good again, and it allowed him to be put in a position where he's brought before the Pharaoh. And because God allowed him to interpret the Pharaoh's dreams, Joseph was made second to the Pharaoh.
It seemed like all of these bad things all helped lead him to the end result. It reminds me of my own personal experiences in my life. And throughout the whole year of 2019, I had to keep going to the doctor and the hospital because I had a concussion, I had the flu, I got infections, and it was awful, and I had to keep going to the hospital because I had so many issues. But once it got to my clinical annual checkup, my doctor was able to look at all of my past visits and see that after each time I had come in to see a doctor, my heart rate and blood pressure kept rising and rising. For instance, in February, my resting heart rate was 114, but by September, it was 133, which is more than double your average person's resting heart rate. So obviously, she figured out that something was wrong, and it wasn't just a case of anxiety that one time I went to the hospital.
That is so cool, man.
Yeah, and that's how they figured out that I actually had an autoimmune disease. It was all of those trips to the hospital. So it's important to realize that all of these bad things, they're going to lead to something greater and something that might be beyond your understanding right now, but they will come into your understanding. It makes me think of the Ecclesiastes verses that are very, very famous. So in Ecclesiastes chapter 3, beginning in verse 1, it says, "There's a time for everything, and a season for every activity under the heavens. A time to be born and a time to die. A time to plant and a time to uproot. A time to kill and a time to heal. A time to tear down and a time to build. A time to weep and a time to laugh. A time to mourn and a time to dance. A time to scatter stones and a time to gather them. A time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing. A time to search and a time to give up. A time to keep and a time to throw away. A time to tear and a time to mend. A time to be silent and a time to speak. A time to love and a time to hate. And a time for war and a time for peace." There's always going to be situations in your life where it's going to be a time for something. You can be sad, you can have that time to cry and be distressed, but then later on, maybe even a week later or a day later, you can be joyful and have laughter in your heart. There's always going to be times for that, and that time is set. by God. There's always going to be a purpose for God's time.
That reminds me of Esther, like when she was put in that position where she could save her people, and all she had to do was go talk to Xerxes, the king. And so, she did the 3 banquets, and she had all the time to tell him, but it wasn't the right time until the 3rd banquet. That's when God wanted her to talk to Xerxes. And if she had done it the night before, it might have had a different outcome.
Yeah, it's always God's plan to wait. And what about the fact that God put Esther in her position in the first place? Mm-hmm. One of my favorite verses in the entire book of Esther is, "For such a time as this." It's such a famous verse, and it's an amazing outlook on life. If you are here for such a time as this. So if we take in our current situation with COVID-19, everything that's going on in our nation and our world, we are put into this mindset if we think we are here for such a time as this. It's just inspiring, and I can't praise God enough, because if I'm put into this situation, then I'm there for a reason, and that's God's plan. So, good job, God.
A personal experience I think of is I always have a lot of trouble, or I've had a lot of trouble with friendships and best friends and stuff like that, where when I get upset over them or something like that, I can't rely on them to help me. I can't rely on them for support. I have to rely on God. So troubled times like that, I can't rely on friends. I rely on God. And that really helps me when I have times like that,
Mm-hmm.
bad things happen, I rely on God. It makes me think of Caleb and Joshua from the book Joshua. When the Israelites finally entered the promised land, all the Israelites wanted very, very lush valleys and a good land. But Caleb, he wanted a mountain, hard terrain to live on.
Mm-hmm.
So he would rely on God rather than rely on the earth, on his own strength for the earth.
Yeah.
So I always thought that was really cool.
Yeah, it's always interesting because there's so many stories. We've mentioned a couple. There's so many stories of bad things happening, and it's God's plan. But you have to choose each morning to put your faith in Jesus in order to be reliant on his plan and his purpose for you. Mm-hmm. Because if you don't choose that day, then you're not putting your faith in him. And I struggle with this all the time. There are days that I choose to rely on my own strength when I shouldn't. It's not good. It's not going to be a great outcome for me. And there's no other way to build character.
Yeah, in tough times.
In tough times and facing hardships, there's no way. And it's just, that's how God builds us up, is through those difficult times.
That's how we walk on our path with God. It's how we have a relationship with him. Yeah. It's because we have these tough times, and that's when we need to rely on him.
And I've heard this saying, in March and in April when I was in school, my teacher would say, after this is all over, we're going to have a lot of character because COVID is such a hard time, and we're going to have a lot of character built in us. And yes, we're all being put in a difficult time right now. We're all dealing with COVID, and we're all dealing with the consequences of COVID. And it's just hard to keep in that mindset that there's a reason for it, but it makes your outlook on life so much better and so much more concrete because it's on God.
Thinking about this topic, it reminds me of the movie Inside Out. So the message from that is you don't always have to be happy. There's times when you need to be sad. Sometimes social media tells you that you have to be happy all the time.
Yeah,
always
put on
be happy.
Smile.
Put on a smile, yeah. And then, there are times when you need to let it out, be sad, Otherwise, you might have mental health problems, and that's not very good.
Yeah, it's always important not to stay built up and have all these emotions inside you. You need to let them out. Ecclesiastes says there's a time to weep, and you have the proper time. It's coming, or it's now. And that's just always super important. I like the example you brought up of Inside Out. It was a good way of bringing up that message that you don't always have to be happy. And when I'm scrolling on social media and I see all of these people, they're probably like on a vacation and they're so happy, but I know like a lot of them are just putting up this facade and putting up this face. They're not actually happy. And it's so important to show your real side too, otherwise you become fake. Yeah. So I guess the most important thing to take out of this is that success through God and your life will always come from
Failure
and tough times, because that's what builds character. Thank you.